Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. My name is Dov Waxman. I'm a professor of political science, international affairs and Israel studies, and the current holder of the Stotsky Professorship in Jewish Historical Studies. In that capacity, I chair the university's Holocaust Awareness Committee, which is comprised of faculty and students from across the university from a range of colleges. Let me just tell you a little bit about what the Holocaust Awareness Committee does and what we're doing from this year onwards before we introduce our speaker for this evening. Since 1977, Northeastern University has organized an annual week-long series of events dedicated to publicly remembering the Holocaust, not only as a historical fact, but also as a memorial to its millions of victims and as a warning that the horrors of the past must not be repeated. The Holocaust Awareness Committee was first constituted in 1991 in order to carry out the university's commitment to remembrance and awareness of the Holocaust. And since then, each year, we look for ways to keep the memory of the Holocaust fresh in our minds and relevant to our students. We invite survivors of the Holocaust to share their stories. We have lectures and panel discussions. We screen films, and we stage theatrical productions each year. This year, we're doing all of that, but something new as well. We have decided to rename our annual Holocaust Awareness Week, starting this year, Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. Now, the Holocaust remains a central focus of the week's activities, but our program will now expand to include events designed to educate students and the wider community about other genocides and to raise awareness about the ongoing threat of genocide in the world today. As the Holocaust recedes further into history and as the cohort of those with lived experience of it becomes increasingly smaller, we believe that it is important not only to ensure that the uniqueness of the Holocaust is not forgotten, but also to ensure that students and the community are aware of other genocides that have occurred in the past century. And we feel obligated to promote awareness of the continuing risk of genocide in the world today in accordance with the vow, never again. That was what leaders in the United States and throughout the world declared after the Holocaust. Yet, tragically, since the Holocaust took place, genocides have occurred in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur. And that's why our theme for this year, from never again to again and again, calls into question the international community's commitment to prevention of the Holocaust and raises the question of why the international community has not fulfilled the promise it made following the Holocaust. Our distinguished speaker this evening, Adama Dieng, will no doubt discuss that very question. And before I turn over to Dean Poiger to introduce him, let me briefly tell you a little bit about the other events that we have over the course of this week. Tomorrow evening, starting here at 6 p.m., we will have a reception to officially launch the Holocaust Awareness Committee's digital archive, an archive of all of the prior years' Holocaust awareness events and the committee's deliberations and discussions. In addition, we will hear a presentation by Elizabeth Levy, a graduate student at Northeastern, who is this year's Gideon Klein Scholar. And then following that, from 7:30 to 9 p.m., we will hear Professor Omer Bartov, who is a distinguished professor of European history and German studies at Brown University, deliver this year's Morton Lecture on the topic Anatomy of a Genocide, Lessons of Studying Mass Murder from Below. On Wednesday, in lunchtime, we will have our annual Philip Blackstrom Survivor Lecture. This year's speaker is Gerald Horton. He will be recounting his experience on the Kindertransport, which rescued him and thousands of other Jewish boys, children, teenagers, and girls from Nazi Germany right before World War II. And then finally, on Friday from 12 to 1:30, we'll be having a student symposium in which political science students who are seniors will present the work that they've done, particularly on the genocide in Rwanda, that they've been doing under the leadership of Professor Natalie Borman in her capstone course this semester. So we have a whole series of events over the course of this week addressing both the Holocaust and the continuing threat of genocide in the world today. And I hope you will attend as many of these events as possible. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our Dean, Rootaberger. She is the Dean of the College of Social Science and Humanities and a Professor of History at Northeastern. Before coming to Northeastern as Chair of the History Department in 2001, Dean Poiger taught at the University of Washington, where she was the Giovanni and Anne Costigan Endowed Professor of History and Adjunct Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Her research, she examines German culture and society in a transnational perspective, addressing questions of Americanization, globalization, imperialism, and comparative history, and she's the author of Jazz, Rock, and Rebels, Cold War Politics and American Culture in a Divided Germany, and currently working on 2 books, in addition to being our Dean, Beauty and Business in Germany and International History, and Germany, Cold War and Beyond. I'm delighted to turn the evening over to Dean Poiger. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. As Dov Waxman mentioned, we are beginning this year's week on conversations about the Holocaust, this week with a long tradition at Northeastern University, really starting in 1977. We are beginning this week, this year, in a new spirit, and I think it's a spirit that I very much welcome. The spirit is to make comparative genocide and the question of the prevention of atrocities more broadly defined, an even more key feature of these conversations on the Holocaust on our campus. And we are doing that at a very important historical moment, and are very much honored to begin these conversations with a particularly distinguished guest, the Honorable Adama Dieng. This month and next mark the 25th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi and moderate Hutu in Rwanda, and indeed, even the language one uses there is always loaded. And indeed, we are catching you, our distinguished speaker, on your way to the official conference and commemorations in Kigali. Events like the genocide in Cambodia, although for a long time it was actually not called genocide, events like the atrocities and genocide in Bosnia, events like the genocide in Rwanda, have always brought to broader publics the realization that genocide and atrocities, in fact, have all too often become contemporary realities. Certainly, the Rwandan genocide made that clear in the 1990s, along with the events in Bosnia, made it clear that the mantra of never again had, in fact, sadly, not become a reality after the murder of 6 million European Jews at the hands of Germans and their collaborators in the context of World War II. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Dieng with us today as someone who was so closely involved with and indeed led efforts to think about and realize the extremely difficult task of bringing about justice after atrocity. Not just justice, but also recovery and bringing about social cohesion after atrocity, as is an ongoing project for all societies who experience genocide. Mr. Dieng was especially involved in these questions through his important role in the International Tribunal that brought leaders of the Rwandan genocide to justice in Arusha in Tanzania. He also will be able to share with us his insights about the power of different justice systems and his insights into the challenges and possibilities in the prevention of genocide and other atrocities. For me, as someone, you heard earlier that I am a German historian, among other things. You, of course, also hear my accent. I was indeed born in Germany and grew up in Germany. As someone who encountered the word Holocaust first in the mid-1970s when the American ABC series Holocaust was shown on German television, who had and we can talk more about the ways in which history and the history of World War II has in fact changed in public perceptions over time. But for someone like me, who is also, among other things, a German historian, who started to teach the Holocaust and comparative genocide in 2004 at my former institution, the question of Rwanda has always raised really important issues. It has raised important issues, including important comparative issues about the power of racism, the question of how relations between neighbors can be corrupted in relatively short order, people living close to one another, has always also raised very important questions about the role of states and the role of international organizations when we confront atrocities. Again, we are so very honored indeed to hear about such matters today from Adama Dieng. Let me just say a few more words about him. Adama Dieng is the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and that is a very important role indeed. Some of you have probably Googled his office or looked him up. If you Google his office, you will see that he issues many thoughtful and thorough statements with his office on the question of atrocities, and again, with the sad realization that never again has not become a reality. Indeed, I think it is multiple times each month that his office issues statements about atrocities or the question of how to prevent atrocities in today's world. Adama Dieng holds degrees in law from Dakar University and also from the Hague Academy. He started his legal career in Senegal, where he held several positions before becoming Registrar of the Supreme Court of Senegal. He has also served as Secretary General of the Geneva-based International Commission of Jurists, and he has been a board member of various institutions, including the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, the Africa Leadership Forum, and the International Institute of Humanitarian Law. Very importantly for today's conversation, he was also the registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha in Tanzania. Moreover, Adama Dieng was the driving force behind the establishment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and also behind the drafting of the African Convention to Fight Corruption. It is really an immense honor for us to have Adama Dieng kick off and kick is really not ever the right word, but really start off our conversations about the Holocaust and comparative genocide with his remark on possibilities for prevention of genocide today. Please join me in welcoming Adama Dieng.
Thank you very much, Uta. Thank you, Waxman. Thank you to all of you. Let me first say that I'm extremely delighted with the decision taken by your board to change the title of your week from Holocaust awareness to include genocide awareness. This is not something specific to your university. I was telling to our sister behind you that a couple of years ago, I was in Paris, and I had to engage a dialogue with the president of the Jewish community there in France, because not only you, but many people thought that it was maybe a way to diminish the seriousness of Holocaust when you put it side by side with genocide. But that is not true. I mean, no doubt that the Holocaust is unique. This is a very special genocide, no doubt. However, we have to realize that at the time of the Holocaust, there was, in fact, the word genocide was at that time being coined by Raphael Lemkin. And in 1948, 71 years ago, it was adopted. And one of the frustrations of Lemkin was that before the Nuremberg Tribunal, the Genocide Convention was not applied. In fact, for the first time, the 1948 Genocide Convention was applied. That was in Arusha, for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And I used to say that Arusha was the tribune of the premier, you know, and that is where also for the first time, and later on I will speak about it, the first case, the Akayesu case, when rape committed under certain circumstances was considered as genocide. But today I'm here, of course, to address first and foremost, not the members of the faculty, but first and foremost, these young students who are the future of our world. And today we are living in a world of turmoil. You said earlier, both Jutta and Waxman, that at the end of the Second World War, the world cried, never again. But never again, unfortunately, became time and again, time and again. I just returned on Friday evening from Bangladesh. This was my second visit to the refugee population in Cox's Bazar. Believe me or not, when I was there in March 2018, I can read from the faces of the various people I was interviewing the trauma they were going through. Those young girls who were raped, those husbands who had their wife raped under their eyes. It was very, very moving. And this time when I returned there, of course, their conditions of living in the camp, if one can say that, had improved a lot. My wife, who is here with me, works for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And as a matter of fact, 1st April 1994 reminds us and I something. I was in Rwanda at that time. 1st April, I visited the leadership of the Rwandan Patriotic Front and the Rwandan Patriotic Army. And she was in Butare. The following day, 2nd April, I met with President Habyarimana. I was in fact the last person he met at the palace. Just before me, he had a meeting with the US ambassador in Rwanda. And the reason I met with him was simply to try to convince him to withdraw a case he brought before the Paris Court against Human Rights Watch, FIDH, which is the International Federation of Human Rights based in Paris, and the Broadband Center in Canada, which is the Canadian Center for Democratic Development, Human Rights and Democratic Development. Habyarimana sued those three organizations, their leaders, for defamation. Why? Because in the report they released, it was stated that he presided over the meeting during which decision was taken to launch the massacres of Kibuye. That was in 1992. And this shows simply that before 1994, there were already a large number of cases of murder, human rights violation being committed with a rampant impunity. And that day, I said to him, Mr. President, this will be really a shame. For the first time in history, a head of state suing a non-governmental organization, a human rights NGO, that's not acceptable. And his answer was, well, it's not for me, it's for my children. Because one day, people will say, well, your dad was the one who presided over that massacre. But simply to show the complexity of the Rwandan genocide, because there was a small group around. I would not say that he was not involved in whatever, but I can say clearly that the power was no longer with him. If I may say one thing, that is how terrible was that genocide. Within 100 days, days of madness, near 1 million people were slaughtered in the most senseless tragedy. A tragedy that completely defies human imagination. They were killed simply because of their ethnic Tutsi identity. Rwanda has come a long way since the dark days of 1994. But the scars of those days are still evident when we listen to the testimony of the survivors, and also when we look at the continuing impact of the genocide and its aftermath on the region. To the survivors of the genocide, we owe a commitment to take all possible measures within our power to protect population from another Rwanda. There is no excuse for inaction. And the ongoing crises around the world are a clear reminder to all of us that we have to do more to make prevention of atrocity crimes a reality. And when I use atrocity crimes, I mean genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Today, people around the world, men, women, and the elderly, continue to be killed, abused, displaced, and discriminated against on the basis of their identity. We all have a responsibility in this regard. We should redouble our efforts to protect them from atrocity crimes and ensure that all are treated with the dignity and respect that is due on the basis of our common humanity. And that is why I cannot but once again congratulate you for your program on education to Holocaust and the prevention of genocide. We need to continue to invest on education, starting from the young age, from the primary school up to the university. That is important. And once again, congratulations, and you can count on my support. But today, we remember all the victims of the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, a genocide during which Hutu and Tutsi and others moderate who opposed the genocide were also killed. We have today, of course, to recognize the pain and the courage of those who survive it. We must exercise what we call in Kinyarwanda, umuganda, or come together in common purpose to prevent the preventable and counter the cruelty that is taking place today before our eyes. I did make a reference to Myanmar, to the atrocity crimes committed in Myanmar, which a committee of experts tasked by the Human Rights Council considered that it was a genocide. We have seen also what happened in Iraq at the time against the Yazidis. But I think what is, of course, extremely important is that when we speak about Rwanda, I mean, some of you have visited that beautiful country, so beautiful that it was deservingly dubbed as the country of the thousands of hills, in French, le pays des mille collines. And it was also dubbed as le pays du printemps éternel, in other words, the country of the eternal spring. So that shows how beautiful is that country. But it is forever associated with the worst image of humankind. We will never forget the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. But a genocide all the more scandalous because it was witnessed by the international community that made the unspeakable choice of not intervening to prevent or stop it. And whatever the motives, who is to blame for the inaction will certainly be debated for a long time. And I choose to focus here on the lessons learned from the failure, our failure of the past. In Rwanda, the United Nations failed the Tutsis. The Organization of the African Unity failed the Tutsis. And this collective failure shook our institutions and led to reform both the OAU and the United Nations. And among the measures by the United Nations was the establishment by Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2004 on the 10th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, of the position I now hold of Special Advisor on the prevention of genocide, to act as an early warning mechanism within the UN system and a catalyst for action to prevent genocide and related crimes. And just as the United Nations undertook reforms in the light of its failures in Rwanda in 1994 and in Srebrenica a year later, the OAU also was reformed. And the African Union was born, and its Constitutive Act demonstrated a critical shift from the principle of non-interference in the affairs of states to a one of non-indifference to the suffering of the African peoples. And this principle is set out in its Constitutive Act, and precisely that's Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, in which the Union has the right to intervene in grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So one can say that the African Union was effectively the first institution to articulate and institutionalize what we refer today as the principle of the responsibility to protect, which, as you know, is also within my office, and the special advisor on the R2P work under my overall guidance. So, and this was, of course, the African Union Constitutive Act was adopted in 2001, and the R2P principle in September 2005 by the world leaders, drawing the lessons of the failure of the United Nations. And not only the responsibility to protect population against genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, but also responsibility to prevent incitement to the commission of those crimes. And I think that the dimension of incitement is extremely important. And it is more important today than ever when we see what is happening around the world, including in this very same country, United States of America, where we have seen also a spread of hate speech, when we are seeing also white supremacist groups, spreading a language which is simply totally unacceptable. So we have to be very, very vigilant. We should remember one thing, and being at the ICTR at the time of the delivery of that judgment, the media trial, we remember that words kill. Words can kill us in a worse manner than even bullets. So let's remember that the Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. It started long before the gas chambers. It started when the Jews were being dehumanized, were being humiliated, named after animals' names. And the same with the Tutsis. It did not start with the machete, the genocide of the Tutsis. It started long before, when they were named after animals' names. So that was the beginning. And the and the radio of the hatred, the radio of milk-calling, show clearly that we have to make every effort to prevent really the worst, to make sure that hate speech do not spread. And we have seen, unfortunately, today, neo-Nazi groups spreading around the world. And that is why last October, the European Parliament passed a resolution. And that resolution shows clearly the link between hate crimes and hate speech. I mean, I closed this parenthesis, but I thought it was important to underline the importance of prevention to incitement. And over the last 25 years, we have witnessed, of course, unprecedented efforts to prevent mass atrocities and to effectively prosecute them when they occur. These efforts gave birth to the many institutional frameworks for the prevention of mass atrocities, which I just described. But they have also culminated in the effective coming into force of a permanent international criminal court, the ICC. The ICC, which the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, doesn't like very much. And I do believe that it shows how important it is when you listen to what Mr. Bolton said about the ICC. If it was not very important, I don't think he would have paid attention and said those words. But we have also seen and witnessed NGOs and the civil society joining the chorus and proving very often to be invaluable watchdogs, detecting warning signals, documenting systematically human rights violations, and despite the risk associated with such an endeavor. International networks like Interpol, Eurojust, and the like serving as very useful platforms of cooperation to make the world a small place to hide for those who have indulged in violation of international humanitarian law. But this development, of course, all contribute to the legal and operational framework for the prevention of atrocity crimes around the world. And this international mobilization, of course, is to be praised, for we cannot afford to have a repeat of April 1994. But we have not vanquished our demon. Myanmar, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Syria, the DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Mali, Central African Republic, Yemen, and I have not named them all. All these countries have attracted attention after Rwanda. We have dealt with some of these conflicts with some level of success to avoid the worst. In some cases, we have not been as efficient, as effective, as swift as we ought to have been to save human life and bring about peace. And one may ask, why are we still seeing so many situations in which atrocity crimes are being committed? Is it not because atrocity crimes are not preventable or we do not see them coming? Let's just remember that atrocity crimes do not happen like overnight. They take time to prepare. And there are many warning signs along the road. And we know, of course, today what those warning signs are. And I should say that when I joined this office, the first things I did was to get a group of academics, researchers in history, in law, in international relations, affairs, to go through cases of the past, learning from the past, and to identify the risk factors which, if not halted, could lead to genocide, to crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And this is a tool for prevention, and I encourage you to go into our website where you will find it in all the UN official language. So I can say that at the root of atrocity crimes are relations between different groups based on their identity and the impact of these relations in terms of access to resources and to decision-making processes. The conflicts that we see today around the world are rooted in identity conflicts. Deliberate acts of discrimination and intolerance by some groups against others on the basis of ethnicity or religion, incitement to hatred and hostility against communities based on who they are, not what they have done, the manipulation of identity for political purposes and economic gains. So, if we accept that atrocity crimes are processes, it is possible to identify warning signs that they might occur. And this is particularly true in the case of genocide and crimes against humanity. And if we understand the root causes and precursors of these crimes, and we can identify risk factors that can lead or enable their commission, it follows that we can also identify measures that can be taken by states and the international community to prevent them. And the earlier we can identify the risk factors, and the greater the opportunities for taking action to address them are. And as time goes on, preventive action becomes more difficult and costlier. If, for example, the motivation behind increased violence against a group is recognized at an early stage, it will be possible for the state or the international community to develop strategies aimed at addressing and diffusing this motivation. However, if atrocity crimes are already occurring, the options available to respond will be very limited and much more complicated. This is something that we understand very well, but unfortunately, we still struggle to mobilize the necessary support for preventive action at an early stage, and particularly at the United Nations. When we are faced with so many crises around the world, the tendency of states is to throw resources at responding to them and to invest less in the less visible work of preventing tensions from escalating into a crisis. So, how can we identify those early warning signs? And as I mentioned, this question is part of the raison d'etre of my mandate as the special advisor, and one of my key roles is to alert the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Security Council through him when I see a risk of genocide or other atrocity crimes in any situation around the world. And of course, this has been maybe successful in the case of Central African Republic, when I sounded the alarm following area formula meeting with the council members. I did say, when I came out of the room, what I have seen in CAR reminds me the early days before the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. That story was picked by the New York Times the following day, on a Saturday. And on Monday, the Secretary General at that time, Ban Ki-moon, said, well, this is very serious. We need to move on. And importantly, the then US Permanent Representative, Samantha Power, who know exactly what means genocide, I'm sure you have read her book. he said to me, Adama, thank you very much for sounding the alarm. This will help me with Washington to get a go-ahead to support a draft resolution. And that is how the peacekeeping operation in CAR was finally established. It took 6 months before it became operational, but at least it was there. Hadn't we made that signal, maybe the worst could have happened. And you certainly remember that the Commission of Inquiry, which was established, concluded that there was an ethno-religious cleansing. So let's remember how important it is to take early action. It's not only about early warning, but it is also important to act earlier. So this framework, anyway, as I said, I will not say much about it. It has helped us to identify in a consistent and systematic manner situations worldwide where there could be a risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And it contains 14 risk factors for atrocity crimes and indicators for each of the risk factors. And among the 14 risk factors, 8 are common to all the 3 categories of crimes I indicated, reflecting the fact that atrocity crimes tend to occur in similar settings and share several elements or features, and this includes, for example, situations of armed conflict or other forms of instability, weak state structures, motives or incentives to commit these crimes, and the most important for our discussions is a record of serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, especially when there has been no real accountability for these crimes. In other words, situation in which the legacies of past atrocity crimes have not been adequately addressed, be it through accountability or other transitional justice measures, such as truth-telling, reconciliation, and reparation, represent a great risk for the reoccurrence of such crimes. And the link, of course, is not difficult to imagine. At the national level, criminal justice is normally seen as a means to deter similar crimes. And for international crimes, this link is similarly recognized. For example, the preamble of the Rome Statutes for the International Criminal Court states that state parties are determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes and thus to contribute to the prevention of such crimes. By prosecuting and punishing the perpetrators of atrocity crimes, you provide a sense of justice to the victims. You also signal that no one is above the law, which can deter the use of violence to achieve political or other goals. When justice is applied fairly and impartially, judicial processes can also contribute to reconciliation and to building sustainable peace, all of which are prerequisite for successful prevention. On the contrary, the failure to provide justice for past crimes can lead to lingering perceptions of injustice, the denial of crimes committed, and the continued discrimination against communities at risk, factors we know increases the risk of atrocity crimes. Unfortunately, this link is not always adequately recognized. In March last year, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-reoccurrence, and myself, we presented a report to the Human Rights Council which explored this topic. And in the report, we recognize the contribution of accountability and other transitional justice initiatives such as truth-telling, reparation, and reconciliation to the prevention of atrocity crimes. we recommended states with a past of atrocity crimes to implement comprehensive transitional justice policies that also address the root causes of the violence. By doing so, transitional justice policies can have a strong preventive impact. So, dear students, a lot of progress has been made in the field of accountability. At the international level, we have seen it when it comes to genocide and other atrocity crimes, and we witnessed that over the past decades. The ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, and subsequently the ICC as a permanent institution are among these achievements. But we should not forget that the Judicial Forum imposes predetermined values to all actors, that the sanctity of human life cannot be dismissed, and that the origin, ethnicity, gender, or spiritual creed is equal. This straitjacket is, of course, very uncomfortable to those who believe in some form of superiority of one group towards others, which is the fuel for genocide. This explains why, in the beginning of the judicial process, many accused persons would defy the court, refuse to lend it legitimacy, to acknowledge its existence. But as the process is relentlessly set on motion, attitudes change. Accused may deny what they are alleged to have done, but at least they no longer claim it as righteous. And this is already the beginning of an interesting process of acknowledgement of the other as worthy of respect, as an equal human being. And as Professor Yuta reminded us, I have served international justice for over a decade, and I have witnessed this process firsthand. And because of the horror we are seeing today in most of the conflict, I'm referring to the sexual violence in conflict. And just about a week ago, more than a week, on the 22nd, I organized a meeting in New York in the margin of the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, on the issue of gender-based violence. And because, to my view, we need to address seriously this issue of gender-based violence, not only in the armed conflict, but also the domestic violence. That dimension is also need to be addressed. When you see the number of cases of domestic violence going on. But for me, who was with the ICTR, I cannot but simply say that in September 1998, 4 years after the genocide, the ICTR rendered a historic judgment in the prosecutor versus Jean-Paul Akayesu. That's the case, I mentioned it from the beginning, and this became the first international criminal tribunal to define rape as an act of genocide and to find an individual guilty of genocide on the basis, inter alia, of acts of rape and sexual violence. So the ICTR recognized that genocidal rape during the Rwandan genocide happened to certain women because of their ethnicity, specifically to Tutsi women or Hutu women married to Tutsi men. So the tribunal also recognized that these women were targeted both because of their ethnicity and because of the beliefs and opinions held by Hutus about Tutsi women. So the ICTR viewed rape not as sexual in nature, but as a tool of war, as a violent act perpetrated against a member of a group with the intent of destroying that group. And I think this was an important shift. Let me cite a quote from the trial judgment in the Akayesu case that summarizes why these issues were so important at the ICTR. And I quote, "Sexual violence was a step in the process of destruction of the Tutsi ethnic group, destruction of the spirit, of the will to live, and of life itself." So this conclusion reached almost 20 years ago by a bench of 3 judges of the ICTR in the Akayesu case has changed the approach to sexual violence in international criminal law and international humanitarian law. But I should say that during the first trials of the Rwandan genocide, most of the accused persons were quite worried about the ICTR, while they believed that our judges took orders from the new regime in Kigali. We were also confronted with the opposite view. The government and victims were impassioned to see conviction handed down. They were frustrated that death penalty would not be part of the sanction meted out, that detainees were being treated too well in prison. Acquittal was out of question because they believed that the involvement of many figures was beyond dispute. But as the tribunal proceeded in its business, fair trials were affirmed, harsh sentences were pronounced, but acquittals too. And over time, a real shift in the attitude has emerged, with both sides acknowledging that they must live with those rulings, even if they would have preferred a different outcome. This process may feel unsatisfactory, particularly when people hold a legitimate view that they have not been fully vindicated. But we have nothing better than this imperfect tool we call justice. In the absence of justice, what we have would be the dictate of those who can tip the beam of the balance to their side. And in saying this, I do not mean to downplay the role of the political process in the aftermath of civil wars. And I accept that the political process may even require that justice be deferred to give more chance to peace. And the ICC statute makes room for this scenario under the responsibility of the Security Council. But it would be a mistake to make use of this mechanism just to give respite or get away to powerful political actors. Justice requires strength to prevail, but its momentary weakness should be no reason to jettison it altogether. Just a couple of 2 weeks ago, precisely on the 20th of March, you did follow certainly the appeal judgment of Radovan Karadzic for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For me, this acknowledging that final judgment by the Hague branch of the mechanism for international criminal tribunals was extremely important, because by rendering that judgment, Karadzic was found guilty of genocide for the 1995 Srebrenica massacre, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And to me, as I said in the statement Professor Yuta made reference, I did underline that this appeal judgment confirms that accountability rather than impunity will prevail. That justice alone, however, will not bring genuine reconciliation to communities divided by violence, and it cannot be imposed from the outside. And for me, the real change can only come from self-reflection. The real change can only come from acceptance, consistent and collective efforts to move forward. It takes hard work and perseverance, but it also takes sustained commitment to reconciliation, trust building, and constructive and meaningful dialogue by political and social leaders and citizens. I visited in February 2018 Srebrenica. I visited Donja Gradina and the Partisan Memorial Cemetery in Mostar to pay tribute to all victims. The victims of Srebrenica, as you may know, 1995, but the Serbian victim of Donja Gradina during the Second World War. So to me, it is very important that we always reiterate our concerns at ongoing attempts to deny the gravity of the crimes committed in Srebrenica, which include the glorification of war crimes. Certainly you may have heard that there were even students' dormitories named after war criminals. So that was simply unacceptable. And that's why I consistently underscore that genocide denial is a direct barrier to reconciliation. And a couple of days ago, along with the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, the Brussels Commissioner on the neighboring, the head of the OEC, and myself, we wrote a letter to the presidency of the Bosnia-Herzegovina, calling on them to stand together. Because at the end of the day, there is no other way to bring peace in that region than to also fill this gap of mistrust, deficit of reconciliation in the Balkan. So to me, and I'm sure you would agree certainly with me, Karadzic is not a hero. Karadzic is a criminal. And the true heroes are the survivors. The true heroes are the witnesses of the crimes committed by Karadzic. And they have displayed, as you know, immense courage by coming to the courts to testify. And they never gave up that they would see justice. So I will say, however, that unfortunately many challenges remain. As you know, the ICC only has jurisdiction in countries that have ratified or acceded to the Rome Statute or through a referral by the Security Council. And even though we know the risk associated with allowing impunity for atrocity crime to fester, the international community and the Security Council in particular, in many instances, fail to reach the consensus needed to take action. We have seen it in the situation in Syria. We have seen it in Myanmar, and these two are clear examples of this. Consideration, if you consider this impasse of the Security Council in some of the most serious situations we are faced today, other United Nations bodies have taken steps to fill the gap. I mean, in the case of Syria, the General Assembly in 2016 created the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, for Syria, which is mandated to build case files for criminal prosecution of atrocity crimes. And last year, the Human Rights Council also created a similar mechanism for Myanmar. And while these mechanisms, of course, provide an important avenue to further accountability and ensure that evidence of atrocity crimes is preserved, they also come with their own limitations. For example, both mechanisms lack a clear jurisdiction where to bring the case files that they may prepare. And without a referral of the Security Council to the ICC, this gap will remain. And on the other hand, universal jurisdiction, which is recognized by some states, may allow for some cases to be prosecuted, but does not provide a sustainable solution. So we can also consider the regional approach. We have seen it, for instance, in the case of Hissène Habré, the former president of Chad. We can also expect that, like at the national level, we have had the case of Guatemala with the former president Rios Monte, the former chief of intelligence, who were brought to court to face justice for the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity. I will stop here simply by reminding all of us that we are, as I started from the beginning, we are witnessing increasing divisions between nations and peoples, as well as growing economic and social inequality. And there has been a marked uptick in hate speech around the world, including directed at racial, national, ethnic, and religious communities, migrants and refugees, women, and sexual identity groups. We need to get today more than ever mobilized to really counter this recent increase and amplitude and dissemination of hate speech, which is of a significant concern. And we have also to realize that despite the emergence of brutal non-state armed groups, the most serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, which could amount to atrocity crimes, are still being committed by the armed forces and auxiliary militia of states, and in some cases, the coalition of states supporting them. We have seen it in Yemen. And just recently, a couple of days ago, a hospital was again targeted. These are serious violations of international law, international humanitarian law. We should not accept that to happen. And we should have to make every effort so that weapons are not provided to governments which we believe may use those weapons to commit atrocity crimes. And this will be in the spirit of Article 6 of the Armed Trade Treaty, the ATT. And my good friend, former President Jimmy Carter, as he was saying, we should have dreamed to make our world a world without a weapon, a world where we all will live together, a world where we will summarize our philosophy of integration by saying, I am the other. Because at the end of the day, our world is not threatened by the clashes of civilization, but the most serious threat is the clashes of ignorance. Let's start to understand, to know each other better. Your God is not better than my God. Your culture is not much richer than my culture. Your physical characteristics is not much nicer than. We are one world. We are one humanity. And I thank you once again for your attention.
Mr. Dieng, merci beaucoup de vos propos pertinents. Et si je peux ajouter, Jared Jeff.
Merci, Jared Rootaberger. Yes. I'm impressed. He's speaking my national language from Senegal.
So I want to pick up towards the end when you said that justice cannot be imposed from the outside. 18 years ago, where you're standing now, we had Gerald Gahima speak. Gerald Gahima, you know, was the national prosecutor for crimes of genocide of Rwanda and in Rwanda. A parallel genocide criminal tribunal, which in some sense was morally in competition with the ICTR. So the question is, who should have the right to judge the perpetrators? The international community, as you emphasized in your remarks, or the survivors of the atrocities and the genocide, as Mr. Gahima and the other justices of the national courts of Rwanda would maintain?
Well, thank you very much for this question, Jerejef Suma Harit meaning my friend. As you rightly pointed, one may speak about competition, but I would say rather complementarity. I mean, you have on one hand the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was the international, I would say, jurisdiction to deal with these most serious crimes committed in 1994. You have then the ordinary courts in Rwanda, dealing also with the cases of genocide. But as I said earlier, there were suspicion from the government of Rwanda, but also suspicion from the accused about even the international setting. And at a time of the adoption of the statutes, which established the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Rwanda was a member at the time, was an elected member of the Security Council, and was insisting that death penalty be included in the statute. Of course, that was not out of question. The UN cannot promote abolition of death penalty and establish a tribunal with death penalty being imposed. And second, they wanted the tribunal to be located in Kigali. And that also was not accepted because it was felt that there was so much emotion that it was important to have the tribunal outside Rwanda. And I think that was the right decision. Then you have the third aspect of justice, which was the gacaca system, which is a traditional system of justice. And that gacaca system was criticized by many NGOs from the beginning, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc. And at the tribunal, I was among those who defended that system. Why? Because if you had to go through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, precisely Article 14, right to fair trial, and you want the gachachas to operate, to function within those parameters, you would need more than 200 years to handle all those cases, those individual cases, because you had at that time more than 150,000 people accused of having committed the crime of genocide. So then what was the main objective of the gacaca? That was to make sure that those who committed that serious crime, your neighbor, you know, who killed your entire family, you sit around the tree. He confessed the crimes he committed. And at the end, that was aimed to facilitate, at the end, the reconciliation. The crime is committed, it is recognized, the person is sentenced, and most of the time, these were, of course, cases not of what is called Category 1, cases of genocide, but crime, murders, etc., but not the genocide, because the Category 1 was being tried before the ordinary court. And I think Gahima, at the time, we had even discussion on those issues. And later on, when he left Rwanda, he acknowledged that I was right on the position I was defending. But to my view, justice, the closer to the scene of the crime, the better justice is rendered. I mean, ideally, the justice should have been rendered closer to the scene of the crime so that it can serve more. But where it's not possible, you have to do it. In the case of ICC, for instance, at the time I did encourage the ICC to delocalize its hearings to take place near the scene of the crime. Instead of sitting at The Hague, that the judges move on the seat, be it in DRC, be it in Central African Republic, that would give. But I was not successful, but I will never lose hope that one day judges of the ICC will accept that call I made more than 10 years ago to move and do justice to the victims of those serious crimes where they are living.
Mr. Dieng, thank you again for being with us today. I just wanted to ask a more practical question in terms of working in the UN. And I wanted to ask, when dealing with issues of genocide, where do you find the differences exist between the countries, especially the permanent members, on where they agree and where they disagree on how to respond to genocide or to threats of genocide?
Well, as I was saying earlier, the member state, and unfortunately those who have the leverage, who could prevent really genocide to occur, are those who are failing. Because when you go to the Security Council, you have the 5 permanent members: China, Russia, USA, UK, and France. And I mentioned Myanmar earlier. For the last 10 years, Myanmar has been in a situation of concern. And I remember, I don't know how many statements I have issued on Myanmar. And I don't remember how many times people say, oh, you are exaggerating. Don't speak about this situation. We have to give a chance to the lady of Rangoon. We have to give a chance to this new democracy in Myanmar, which is emerging. There is no risk of a genocide. And what we have seen in 2017, a mass exodus of Rohingya people, those the Secretary General Guterres named the most persecuted group today in our world, crossing the borders of to join Bangladesh. And hopefully, Bangladesh was generous enough. The Prime Minister opened her arms to welcome them. The same image we have seen with the Chancellor of Germany. When the Syrian refugees fled, she opened her arms to welcome them. And that is why last week when I was in Dhaka, Bangladesh, I said that I wish we have a world run by the woman, led by women. It will make a difference. The world would be much nicer than it is today, with men who are macho. If you have a world where you have, like the Prime Minister of New Zealand, what she did after these outrageous killings, attack in the mosque, was simply marvelous. And I said, this is the trio. This is my 3 favorite women leaders today. And we need to promote women leadership around the world. But coming back to the issue. As I was saying, we need to invest more in the Security Council. At the time, France and Mexico, as an elected member, launched an initiative for any member of the council to refrain using its veto when populations are facing the risk of genocide, crimes against humanity. Of course, the idea did not fly within the council. It was later taken by Liechtenstein and other countries, and as of today, 103 member states have signed that draft code of conduct. And let's hope that more states within the General Assembly will sign it. That will be a beginning. Because in 1948, when the world decided to establish the UN, after 1945, when the UN Charter was adopted, the first treaty which has been adopted one day before the adoption of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights is the 1948 Genocide Convention. The Convention for the prevention, it starts with prevention, for the prevention and repression of the crime of genocide. Why starting with prevention? Because this crime is preventable, as I demonstrated earlier. And repression, we have seen that it is possible to punish the perpetrators, and this has been done. But we should not wait until it is committed to repress. Let's invest more on prevention. And because it is a treaty, that prevention is an obligation. You have this obligation to prevent it. And reaching some stage, if you don't act, you are failing your obligation. And we need to invest more. Because I said within 3 years ago, it was estimated that $233 billion were spent on peacekeeping, assistance to humanitarian assistance to refugees, as well as to assistance. Stop 1 second, imagine $233 billion. If you had spent a small percentage of that amount on prevention, we could have certainly used a large part of that amount to help to reduce inequalities, to help to achieve more goals as the one listed in the Sustainable Development Goals. But unfortunately, that might sound idealist. Maybe I'm still an idealist, but let's remain idealists. Let's continue to dream. Let's make it sure that things will happen. A change is going to come. I have no doubt.
How does one get recognition of atrocities for more controversial acts such as the Armenian Genocide?
Well, as you may know, the 1915 massacres which took place in Armenia, committed by the Ottoman Turk army against the Armenian people, has been recognized by some states as a genocide. But of course, for the United Nations to name a particular situation genocide, it requires first and foremost that that case be brought before a court of justice and that there be a legal determination made by such a court. And this is not yet the case, but as I said, there are many states today which consider what happened in 1915 as a genocide, and some have even decided to have a national day devoted to what they consider as the Armenian Genocide. And the most recent was the decision taken by the French President, Emmanuel Macron.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again for coming. We all appreciate it. I understand that prevention is a major goal of your office, but let's say that a situation arises where intervention is necessary. Does your office prefer to see a peacekeeping operation under the purview of the UN, or do you prefer to see state-led multilateral intervention type style?
Could you, the last part of your question?
Does your office prefer to see UN peacekeeping operations, or does it prefer to see intervention led by states outside of the UN?
Well, first of all, I would say to start, at a time when we are witnessing a retreat in multilateralism, starting by from within this country, the guilties in this country, in this attack against multilateralism, I would never support, of course, such an approach of bilateral. But rather, what we need today is more than ever to get the UN stronger, because the UN is here for the people. I mean, if you go back to this is my Bible, this is my Quran, this is my Torah, so international law. And as used to say my good friend Benjamin Ferencz, we just celebrated his centenary, saying, never give hope, never give up, never give up. Law, not war. Yes to law, not to war. And we can make it. If today we have avoided a third world war, that is thanks to this. That is thanks to multilateralism. That is thanks to the UN Charter, thanks to the respect of principles of international law. But the day we will move from this, we'll be in danger. That's why I said we need to continue working towards strengthening multilateralism. Having said that, regional organization can act. And if in the case of Central African Republic, the African did not wait until the UN. It started first with the ECAS, the regional, sub-regional, and then the African Union. And that's only after I made that call that the UN came and to join the troop. You take AMISOM in Somalia, you have the UN, but thanks to the troops which were. And Darfur, when it started, the first to send troops to Darfur was Rwanda, remembering what happened in 1994. You know, so that's why I said I'm in favor of, when it comes really to peacekeeping. And particularly, maybe your question also implied, without you mentioning, the use of force. Speaking about military intervention. And this is the third pillar of the principles of R2P, which is composed of three pillars. The first, that's the primary responsibility of the state. The second pillar is the responsibility of the international community to provide support to a state which is under stress, but which doesn't have the means to protect its population. And the third pillar is the use of force in accordance to the Charter. In other words, then it has to be done, and it has been done in the case of Libya. And we know the result. Resolution 1973, authorizing the NATO forces to bomb. And frustration, because after the bombing, nothing was provided as a follow-up. As we would have said in French, il n'y avait pas de service après-vente. They did not provide the tools so as to make sure that following the intervention, there will be forces in Libya to make sure that there will be no chaotic situation. Today, let's hope that an international conference of the Libyan will get together and find a way. How many years? And this, of course, has led to some camp expressing remorse about the R2P. But others have come also with the idea, like Brazil a couple of years ago, of what they call responsibility while protecting, RWP. So this is something important, but my own position is that military solution should be a last option, And whenever it is an option, a final choice, it has to be done within the respect of international law. Otherwise, it will be if you violate the international law, if you intervene without authorization, that is something which we should not allow, we should not encourage.
I just want to thank you for wonderful, moving, informative, inspirational talk. On behalf of everybody here, thank you for your service and for the work that you do.
Thank you very much.